maybe while I do that, some people you can't see who are behind the camera might eventually wave at me to say we've got some people in the room and we should make a start. I can see them looking at each other and nodding and checking a screen. Okay. And there's a nod. Okay, a nod which says we have some people in the room. So good morning to all of you. Now, so good morning. Make a formal start. So I'll repeat again for people who didn't get the start. Hello, I'm James Kirkup. I'm the director of the Social Market Foundation. You are joining me today in the virtual Social Market Foundation. We're in the office, you're on the internet, for this In Conversation event with Norman Warner, Lord Warner. I'm going to be talking to Norman about his career in Whitehall and Westminster and his book, which we'll be shamelessly plugging, In Pursuit of Competence. We'll be talking more about that. So we're going to have a chat for the next hour or so. There are opportunities to send in questions via the SMF Twitter account. Go to what is it called? The @ at SMF Think Tank, and you'll find all the deals there. So if you've got any questions you want to put to Norman via that method, then pop that in there. We'll get onto them later on, so we'll communicate them to me via some witchcraft electronic technology. So that's the preamble to start. I can stop talking to that thing over there and start talking to you, Norman. Norman, good morning. How are you?
I'm fine. Good form.
Good. Good to hear. So we're here to talk about the book and the book, which is a memoir and your career. Which the plotted summary is it's quite long and interesting, and it starts in the very late 50s and goes through to the 2000s and touches on pretty much every bit of domestic policy. We've got social security, we've got health, we've got social care, we've got crime, we've got youth justice. As an official and as an advisor and as a minister, you've done most of it, all of it. So we're going to try and talk through some of that, and we're starting at the very beginning and bringing us up to the current day, and some thoughts on public services and what might happen to them next in the ideal world. Is that sound a good plan?
Sounds like a plan.
Excellent. All right. So let's get started. So your first job, where do you come from? I mean, you've been fair to say you've been hanging around this postcode for quite a long time.
Yeah, well, the first job was actually as a government auditor in the NHS back in the 1960s. It just shows how old I am. And at that time, the NHS was 12 years, 15 years old. It still looked pretty much like the NHS that Beveridge and Co. designed, and it hadn't changed much. The striking thing about it was that in many ways it had the same problems as it's got now. I mean, there was fraud in the NHS then, there's fraud in the NHS now. But the thing that was different was in that NHS, there were these huge Victorian psychiatric hospitals ringed around London and the big cities with 2,000 lost souls in them, and not much in the way of activities or therapy other than the new drugs that had come on the market. So that, I spent 4 years doing that, fraud, prosecuting, but it gave me a great insight into what the NHS was like locally. And I learned a lesson for life, which was, if you think you know the NHS sitting in Whitehall, think again, because you need to get out there, you need to get a feel of the local organisation.
And I just would take us back for dare I say it, for younger viewers and me. I'm a mere 46. What was the status, the cultural standing of the NHS at the time? Because now, obviously, it's the central institution of British national life. Lots of evidence shows that it's very centrally embedded in almost the understanding of what it is to be British. It's often cited by people as saying, one of the things you're proud of, what are we proud of about this country, the NHS? Was it such a sort of central institution at that time?
Well, it was a central institution because the big change it had made was it was a health service which was free at the point of use on the basis of clinical need. Now that was a kind of strap line that every health minister has to produce at some time or the other to remind everybody. And it was still popular. And you could tell how popular it was because it was the problem child of the Treasury. In the Treasury view, it was consuming too much public expenditure. So not much has changed in 50 or 60 years about the views of the Treasury on the NHS.
And that popularity makes it hard to affect change.
Absolutely.
Managerial or on the expenditure side. And that's something I think we're going to come back to later in the hour.
But nothing had changed organisationally.
Yeah.
In the 60s, it was still 3 parts: local government, the executive council services, family doctor services, and the hospitals. And at the top of the pinnacle were the teaching hospitals. The London teaching hospitals were the peak of the NHS, and no one was allowed to interfere with the London teaching hospitals.
I live near one now in Tooting, so it's still sacrosanct in many ways. But again, we're going to come back to hospitals because one of the things which I think is often missed out in conversations about the NHS is go back to that founding moment. Not everybody joined the NHS, did they?
No.
And there were some questions. There are some questions about doctors, and their relationship with the NHS.
Well, I think what was popular at the beginning, I think GPs were very popular. GPs are on the whole, through thick and thin, until fairly recently, GPs have been popular with most users of the NHS, even though they were gatekeepers, because you couldn't get into specialist services other than through the GP. But if you look at survey after survey after survey of trusted people, up at the top there are GPs.
And so I'm going to doctors to try and move us on from the 60s into the 70s, because by the 70s, still in Whitehall as an official, who are you working for and with by the early 70s?
Well, when we get to the 70s, the Department of Health has become, the Ministry of Health has become the Department of Health and Social Security. So you've got a situation where within one big, huge government department, you've got 2 public services competing for resources. Yep. And that was done by Harold Wilson to give a big enough job, some would say, for the ego of Dick Crosman, who became the Secretary of State. It was the first Secretary of State responsible for both sets of services. And that posed its own problems in the sense that within this department, you had 2 lots of civil servants who'd come up different routes. There were still civil servants who had been involved with the foundation of the NHS in 1948. And then there were social security civil servants who found they had more affinity with the Inland Revenue, because in the 60s and 70s, there starts to be a debate about whether you should try to combine social security with tax allowances, which is where we've ended up with universal credit today. That debate started 40, 50 years ago.
And in that department, that was where you started working for Barbara Castle then?
I worked for Barbara Castle. I'd been in America having a look at my Harkness Fellowship for a couple of years, and I came back, and it was the fag end of Keith Joseph's first attempt at reorganisation of the NHS. Much to his surprise, after the miners' strike, Harold Wilson won an election in March 1974, and basically rescued Barbara Castle's political career by making her the Secretary of State for Health and Social Security. And then I was parachuted into that job as her principal private secretary. Her appointment immediately produced an outbreak of war with the medical profession. So
why?
Oh, well, the BMA was run by a load of male chauvinists, which was a factor which actually played quite a big part in this. But there had been rolling on, but never dealt with, contract negotiations for consultants with Keith Joseph. They then thought they had a bit of a pushover with this woman, so they went big on that. There'd been a on-off dispute with junior doctors about their hours of work, and then there was a row with the NHS unions about private practice in the NHS, private beds and doctors in the NHS doing private work.
Yes.
So we had 3 rows going: the consultants contract, the GP, the junior doctors working arrangements and pay, and a row which was partly self-generated by Barbara on pay beds. A heady mix in a situation where Labour had promised a referendum on the EEC, as it was, and we had OPEC, the 6-day war, the rise. And this has a familiar ring: the price of energy and oil.
You're preempting my.
So
next
the 70s was
something.
like-
Yes, some things don't change that much, do they?
That's right.
Yes. So and the. Sorry, what would I? What did you learn from? What did you learn from dealing with the unhappy doctors and the eventual resolution of their issues?
Well, I learned that you had to try and rub along with. I mean, there was no point in picking fights. To some extent, Barbara and Labour picked a fight over pay beds. Howard Wilson tried to calm it down. Didn't truly work.
Pay beds were
The right of doctors to practice private medicine.
Yes.
I mean, when the health service was set up, doctors were given the right to practice private medicine. That was never taken away from them. And the NHS had paid beds within the NHS hospitals.
This is stuff in their mouths is gold.
Yeah. And so they took this very seriously. They also had had a bit of a row earlier on, before all this, in the GPs. So there was a kind of, it was a fragile truce, which the Conservatives have managed to paper over when they were in office, and it just erupted, basically. And what I learned was, if the BMA decide that they're not going to cooperate with the NHS, any health minister is going to have a very tough time. And if you have all 3 branches of medicine in dispute at the same time, you have a tough job.
Yes.
And it's no good saying they need to learn lessons, da-da-da-da-da. The truth of the matter is you can't run a health service without doctors.
Yeah, and I will declare I have expressed a few opinions over my once or twice in newspaper articles I've written now and again about the BMA, but the central point is the BMA, the organised labour for doctors is an extremely effective political organisation. I mean, it is one of the most powerful political forces in the country.
Absolutely.
For good or ill, whatever you think of it, they are. They have a lot of clout.
But something else was also going on in the 1970s, which was white-collar unions taking strike action. So you had a dispute within the BMA: are we a professional body, or are we going to act like the registered trade union? We are.
Because the BMA is a trade union.
Yeah, it's a trade union.
And they're not. Oddly enough, the BMA is not. The BMA doesn't deny that. So this is an issue I often have with my old colleagues in the media, that the BMA is not often clearly enough reported as being a trade union.
Oh,
the BMA is quite open about what it is, but it's somehow treated as a medical body, not an industrial body.
Well, it's the same as the Royal College of Nursing. The Royal College of Nursing is a registered trade union. And if you're a health minister, whether it was back in the 70s or now, you have to recognise that their motive in life is to do the best they can for their members. That's their job.
Honourable job, yeah. Good. Well, just moving on. That's the 70s, and then by the 79, 80, different government, different prime minister, and you were essentially involved with the Rayner efficiency reviews, which I think are still, that's it's still taught in first or second year politics. So lots of I certainly remember from my undergraduate degree reading about the Thatcher efficiency drives. I think it's still being taught at the moment. But and your particular focus there was on the social security side.
Well, I've been transferred. In his infinite wisdom, the permanent secretary decided I should go onto social security, despite my health background. So I had spent an interesting time in social security, first on policy,
where basically the Thatcher government was terribly interested in containing the social security budget.
Yeah.
And there was a public outcry about scroungers, by people buying coloured television sets on supplementary benefit. So that was a kind of political row. But the other side of it,
again, some things are
they don't
some
change.
things don't change.
They don't change. So the scroungers issue dominated a lot of the policy discussions about means tested benefits.
Yes.
Are they? And we have old dialogues about the deserving poor, effectively.
Yes. Which it's still it's a Victorian conversation, isn't it?
It still takes place from time to time now. The other side of that was the Thatcher government's interesting idea it was interesting idea for permanent secretaries that actually what government departments needed management. They needed ministers to take responsibility for management, and they needed permanent secretaries, not just to serve up policies, but to actually manage their departments. Now that went down like a lead balloon with most members of her cabinet, and certainly with most members of the permanent secretary class. Michael Heseltine was the honourable exception to the ministers, who was quite interested in management and rather good at it. But to make this happen in Whitehall, Mrs. Thatcher brought in Derek Rayner, who was the boss of Marks and Spencer's. And her model, I often thought that her model for the public sector was retail, because Rayner got replaced eventually by Roy Griffiths from Sainsbury's.
Yes.
So if you look at the Thatcher years, these two very effective, highly successful retail giants. In those days, Sainsbury's was a very successful company. Marks and Spencer's was a very successful company.
And over the years, since then, supermarket bosses have come near politics. We had Archie Norman, who came into politics briefly.
Absolutely.
David Cameron brought Philip Green in to try and review government procurement, I remember. There's a belief in, obviously, and running a successful retail company means you understand logistics, you understand delivery, and you understand a customer base, and you're keeping the consent and the support of a population. So you can see how the skills fit. But how did the how well did the Rayner process work out?
I think it was very interesting. It's basically what each government department was told they had to have a Rayner scrutiny, and the Department of Health and Social Security chose payments on my recommendation. Actually, chose how you paid Social Security benefits, which was a big industry, all paid through post offices at the time. But other good departments had similar sort of projects. Now, the problem with it was the permanent secretaries on the whole weren't with Mrs. Thatcher. So the guys and gals who were actually doing these Rayner scrutinies were putting their careers at risk. And if you look at the evidence, very few Rayner scrutineers ended up at the top of the civil service. I don't think any of them did, and many of them left. So the idea that you should, as it was often presented, rat on your mates by actually telling the permanent secretary that you could do things more efficiently was not going to go down well in many Whitehall departments. So there was a problem, but the Rayner scrutinies led to something which did last. If there was a preoccupation with value for money and the Thatcher idea that if you were going to take taxpayer money, put it in government departments, people should use it wisely, should be accounted for it. And it ended up with something which the Treasury latched onto and which did last, and it was called the Financial Management Initiative. And that did also lead to public sector managers being much more responsible for budgets and being accountable for budgets. So some good things came out of this. You could question some of the social policy of that years. I don't think you could seriously question the emphasis on better management.
Now, I want to come back to the civil service and a little later, but I want to continue the chronology. So you left Whitehall in 85? 85 to go to run Kent County Council.
Yeah, well, I had one of those falling out with permanent secretaries that from time to time happen. So I decided to, having made my point and won my point on a promotion, I decided my card would be marked and I was going to leave the civil service. And I was headhunted because of the range of work I'd done to sort out a big social services department, Kent County Council, where the social workers had been on strike for a year. And so I moved to local government, which in those days was something which rarely happened for civil servants in Whitehall. And I had a thoroughly enjoyable time. I mean, you were allowed to do things in local government. You were well away from the control freakery of some government departments. And if you had good ideas in those days, particularly in the counties, you were given some freedom.
That's still true to an extent. Obviously,
Yeah.
with the proviso that local government is now very badly short of money. Yeah. But there's still more innovation going on at the local government level today than is really often appreciated around this part of the world, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, it's much less a written culture. People don't spend their life writing papers, and it's much more doing.
I think tank going very harsh. There's
sorry,
nothing wrong with writing policy papers.
There's nothing wrong with policy papers, but you also need some capacity to implement what you put in the policy papers. And the thing about local government was, certainly in those days, most of the counties had been conservative-led, and Conservatives were much more in the counties, were much more trusting of their officers. I mean, it was different in many Labour authorities. So, but we were given freedom. So you had to do two things: not overspend your budget and not create a scandal. If you did those two things, you were given a lot of freedom. And we introduced in Kent, I thought, interesting ideas about a mixed economy of providers. So why is it always going to be a public monopoly? Why don't we look at people in the voluntary sector? Age concern, we're probably doing better day centres than we were running as a local authority. And why don't we look at what the private sector can do? The private sector was running nursing homes.
Yes.
And was running a lot of home support in community care.
Well, and obviously that's a very pertinent question today. Was the private sector then, do you think, doing a better job of running residential care than than it is today? And relatedly, was it doing so on lower profit margins than it currently enjoys?
Well, the private sector had got into, to some extent by mistake, because of some problems with social security, which we needn't go into. But in the 80s and the early 90s, what you see is a burgeoning of private sector provision of care in residential care and nursing home care. Massive. And around that time, local government was struggling with capital expenditure to repair rather elderly residential care homes. So I think the government and local government welcomed the idea that there was a lot of people out there who were starting to invest in service areas. And then as we invented a system called care management, which was giving care managers the ability to keep people in their own home with freedom to spend budgets for washing, transport, shopping, that kind of support that frail elderly people need. That took off as an idea that you didn't have to crawl over the expenditure of small sums of money. You trusted care managers who were going to look after people in their own home and ensure they were looked after. And that grew out of the work we did in Kent in the late 80s.
And then briefly before we get to the new Labour years, one are children's services and the reviews. Virginia Bottomley asked your character to review.
Yeah. Well, what happened in the 1980s? The whole issue of child sexual abuse rose rapidly up the public agenda in the 1980s. Physical abuse had started in the 70s, and we were starting to find that you couldn't rely on families necessarily to safeguard their children. So the state, through social services, was being more and more required to protect children through the child protection services. And that forced social services into relationships with the health service, doctors seeing children being brought into A&E departments in bad shape. It forced us to open up negotiations with the police. So this whole issue of child protection grew into an industry in the late 80s, early 90s. And it forced all these public services to work together.
The multi-agency approach.
Yeah.
And then I guess that was the start journey back to Westminster, wasn't it? Because we were by this point, we're now into the mid 90s, and the Labour government, sorry, the major government was winding down, fair to say, heading towards the election in 1997 of Michael Tony Blair and New Labour. Now, what was your role? What was your role in that?
Well,
in
I
97, before and after.
I'd left at the back end of 1991. I'd left local government. I'd done my 6 years. I didn't want to carry on doing that. We got community care going well with Roy Griffiths, established as a principal, and I'd chaired an inquiry into children's homes, where there had been in children's homes a massive amount of child sexual abuse. So I was quietly running my life as a jobbing management consultant, and I got involved. I'd known Jack Straw quite well when I worked for Barbara Castle in the 70s, and had remained friendly with him.
Because he was a special advisor.
He was a special advisor in the 1970s. And he had become, Tony Blair had become leader of the Labour Party. Jack had become the Shadow Home Secretary. And we had a conversation which led to me starting one day a week as his senior policy advisor. And we got into the whole business of how does Labour prepare itself for government? It's been in opposition for 18 years. It has very few people who've been ministers. You've got the same problem for Labour today. And so you've got a situation where if they went, and it was becoming very clear in 1996, which is when I jumped ship, so to speak, into working with Jack. It became very clear in 1996, Labour were going to win the next election. So Blair's sort of chief support person, chief executive, Jonathan Powell, started to run these preparations for government in Oxford. And I decided with Jack that we really needed to have if we were going to go into the Home Office in 96, 97, we needed to know what we were going to do, because on day one, we weren't the opposition anymore, we were the government. And people expected the government to govern. So what were we going to do? And at that time, there was a huge amount of concern about antisocial behaviour.
Yes.
So
it's like I was looking at the pledge card, the 5-point pledge card that Labour handed out in the 1997 election. And I can't remember, the second pledge was swift and effective justice for young offenders. Jobs were the sort of the apex of the conversation at times.
So there was, but it was not all negative. I mean, the papers we were developing was, we got to tackle antisocial behaviour. We got to deal with neighbours from hell. We got to deal with these broken housing estates where the residents have a miserable time. So we developed something called the Crime and Disorder Bill, and invented what went into the national lexicon as antisocial behaviour orders. But at the same time, we wanted to reform the youth justice system. And that was because youth court magistrates were telling us, the classic one was a magistrate came to tell us that this young kid, that is 15, 16-year-old, stood up in his court and said, "You can't send me to prison because I haven't had my 15 warnings, cautions." So there was a problem about what was effective justice.
Yeah.
How could you control antisocial behavior? And it wasn't about high-level crime. It wasn't about the mafia and drug cartels. It was about day-to-day living in many parts of our society.
Well, was that the time when people started talking about William Bratton and broken windows?
That's right. The work had gone on in New York, where the idea was if you didn't tackle the low-level crime,
the broken window,
escalates.
It
just escalates.
The whole street gets dragged
Absolutely.
down. I mean, I don't know, again, we've talked about things that were current in the 70s, 80s, 90s. This is something that isn't quite yet being echoed in contemporary politics, is it? But which I'm surprised by, I have to say. I mean, I think because you look at polls, there is quite a lot of evidence to suggest that actually crime is worrying voters more than necessarily politics recognises. Do you think could this be another of the say historical echoes that we get back to in the next few years, do you think?
Well, what is interesting is by the time you get to 2000, knife crime's a big issue. I mean, you've got the Prime Minister chairing COBRA to tackle knife crime.
Yes.
So the idea that knife crime's new, forget it. Knife crime was a big issue in the cities by the time you get to the end of the 90s. And the Stephen Lawrence, the catalyst for change was the Stephen Lawrence murder, which was a knife crime.
Yes.
Stabbing at a bus stop.
Yes.
So
actually, it's not too much. Dates right, not that much longer. There was another murder, a man called Philip Lawrence.
Yeah,
who was a head teacher who
absolutely
stabbed outside his school in North London, which I don't remember. It hasn't had the same sort of historic resonance, but at the time was also another one of those moments that sort of catalyzed the issue. No, I'm sort of so I've been slightly surprised that actually not going to get into party politics that the Labour Party hasn't made more of that stuff, given that it's currently led by a former Director of Public Prosecutions. But
well, I'm no longer.
Maybe it's coming. Yes,
I'm no longer a member of the Labour Party.
I
look with interest as to what they will do.
And yes, the crossbench peer, you're at home at the cross-party sort of market foundation. So again, look in the book, you talk about the inheritance you got from Michael Howard at the Home Office, and I was struck just going over last night. One of the things you inherited was a prison ship, which very reminded us. We tend to think that today, slightly sort of gimmicky, silly policy is a modern invention. It's still there's a much longer history of slightly daft ideas and public policy to make tabloid headlines, isn't there? Was that a fair description of the prison ship?
Yeah, well, the prison ship was, I think if I'm honest, prison ship was one of our mistakes. We were consulted by, as always happens with elections, particularly if you think you're going to lose, you're going to be out of government. There is a kind of exchange on current problems which are going to overlap with any new government. The prison ship was one. Michael Howard had decided to sail this thing across the Atlantic, believe it or not. And it was
not personally,
but it was
sailed across
a very considerable public expense. It had been sailed across the Atlantic and had been moored in Dorset. And don't imagine a cruise ship.
No.
I mean, it was a prison. It was very metallic. And it was actually very big. So it was several stories. I thought we should not have actually accepted this, but we did accept it. And we then tried it for a while. And it made me very nervous because I was terrified that there was going to be a fire in this thing. We would end up having to take responsibility as a new government. But all ended well. It was used for a while, and I've never found out what happened. But I think it was only useful for scrap by the time we got to the end of its life.
And then if we can move on through the years, fast forward a little through the new Labour years, go from Jackson Home Affairs policy, and by when did you come back to health under Labour?
Well, in 2001, I became the chairman of the new Youth Justice Board, doing the youth justice reforms. And 1999, I started that. By the time we get to 2003, there was nothing more I could do there. I was looking to do something new. And Tony Blair rang me up and asked me to become a health minister in 2003. And it was prompted by Alan Milburn as the health secretary leaving government, John Reid being appointed as the health secretary, and I became the new Lords Minister, mainly responsible for pharmaceuticals, their purchase, their regulation, and so forth. So I became a health minister, which meant that I had to take all the health legislation through the House of Lords. And I started with foundation.
And the context of this was a lot of money and a desire to get the most out of that money. Is that fair?
Well, what had happened was Labour had been very cautious after 90. For the first 3 or 4 years, they've been very cautious.
Stuck Ken Clark's spending plan.
Yeah,
even Ken Clark said he didn't think it was realistic to project the image of fiscal responsibility.
It became increasingly clear that we were falling behind in a dramatic way the annual expenditure per capita of the EU countries. So we had a problem. I mean, and what was then invented essentially was Gordon Brown was going to basically, Tony Blair announce on television that he was going to.
I was going to say, well, David Frost on a Sunday. I started my career as a lobby correspondent a couple of years beforehand. I remember it was a Sunday morning. Tony Blair announced that I forget the number.
Well, we were going to get up to the EU
European outbreak led to Gordon Brown was not very happy that his budget, his flipping budget, I think was not the phrase he used. His flipping budget had been stolen by the Prime Minister on live TV. Yes. So lots of money in the NHS, but also a desire to make sure that money was actually going to be used to maximum effect.
So we had to explain to the British people how we were going to use this money and what they were going to get, which led to targets, essentially. The A&E target, you wouldn't wait longer than 4 hours in an A&E department. You would see a GP within 48 hours. What halcyon days, you would see a GP within 48 hours. And if it was urgent, within 24 hours.
Yeah.
So there were a series of targets which we needn't go into, but the most prominent of which was the GP one and the A&E department, because this had real meaning to people, because the entry into the NHS was usually either through a GP or through an A&E department. That's how you got in. So that issue of access, speedy access to clinical care was the feature of the Blair target regime. Now, did the NHS like it? Well, they liked the money, not so sure they liked all the targets. But we always made it clear that under no circumstances should a target supersede a clinical judgment. So whatever, if that was paramount. But I think despite the muttering and grumbling, there were a lot of people in the NHS who bought into targets because they didn't want to see A&E departments like zoos with huge numbers of sick people, ambulances waiting outside. They didn't want to see that. No one working in the NHS wanted to see that. And there was mutterings, and we probably paid a bit over the odds in terms of some of the salary settlements. But what it did do, it ended up, but within 3 or 4 years, with if you looked at the Ipsos Mori surveys of public attitudes to the NHS, 75% of people thought the NHS was doing an excellent job. It's down near 25% at the moment, if you want to make a comparison. So you have got a combination of a lot of extra money. We're talking 6 to 7% real terms increase year on year for 4 or 5 years. But also driven performance.
Yes, and structural and some structural reform as well.
There was a private finance initiative on new buildings, which has a slightly checkered
Yes.
history.
And foundation hospitals.
And
which-
foundation
which became the
hospitals giving
Parliament-
much.
the
There was a
parliamentary
lot more
national-
interest in foundation trusts, independent hospitals, out of the control, which didn't please the Treasury of Whitehall, out of the control of Whitehall. But we also had two things also that didn't start immediately, but did start soon after the injection of all this money. One was patient choice, revolutionary idea.
Yes.
You should have more choice over where you got your
Yes.
treatment or your diagnosis.
Choose and book.
Choose and book, and all.
Yeah.
We had to invent an IT system that would work for that. Patient choice was extremely popular with patients. And if you were a class warrior, as bits of the Labour Party were, you could actually point to quite good data, which showed choice actually mattered as much to the working class as the middle classes. So we had quite good data saying that choice was popular across the political and socio-economic spectrum. So patient choice, and it was a challenge. I mean, it put some hospitals on the spot, because if they had very long waiting lists, then you go somewhere else. You find out where there's a consultant who will see you.
And so to you, so the book, in the book, you make a very detailed and convincing critique of the NHS. And one of your central point really is about we're coming back to hospitals. It's about the preponderance of hospitals. It's about your argument, I think, and correct me if I'm misinterpreting you, is that the big acute hospitals, for reasons of politics and managerial inertia, have come to be too important, that there too much resources going to them, and that means that it's not possible for health policy to easily pivot to addressing some of the community-based issues around public health, around obesity. Am I capturing it fairly there that we've made the big hospitals too important?
I think that's right. When the money was injected, there were problems with the hospital, no doubt about it. There were hospitals in some places, there were problems. So it was almost inevitable. If you suddenly have 6-7% real terms increase a year, a big chunk of that money is going to go into hospitals. The problem became they kept going into these hospitals.
Yeah.
So if you put some of the things right in hospitals, and the A&E department wait is a good example, you had to reorganize the way hospitals functioned to deliver that target. So you couldn't say, well, you're going to deliver all this without any extra money. But by the time you get to after the 2005 election, it becomes apparent that not enough of this extra money is going into the services outside hospital. And it's quite clear, and it's not just about GPs, it's becoming quite clear that the community health services are deteriorating. They're certainly not improving as much. Public health is still a big issue now. I mean, it's becoming a bigger issue because what you've got is unhealthy lifestyles fueling the demand for health services.
Yes. Yeah.
With obesity in the lead. So it's becoming clear that you've got a problem which is not going to be solved simply by having more and better hospitals.
But hospitals are very politically powerful, because as soon as you touch a hospital in a reform or closure, politicians, voters get excited, politicians get excited, and reform gets harder. So I'm sure, I've no doubt that both Sajid Javid and Wes Streeting, the Secretary of State for Health and his shadow, are both watching us at the moment, or will be later on YouTube. I mean, they are both looking at a similar question, which is how to make health services deliver better service and probably more choice for the tax-paying public over this decade and the next one. What advice would you have for them on the basis of, dare I say it, 4 or 5 decades of experience looking at looking at and trying to get better out of the NHS?
Well, I think they have now got a problem because they have huge waiting lists
Yeah.
for diagnostic services and elective surgery. Huge waiting lists. 6 million, could be 7, could be 8. It's a lot. So they are going to have to channel some money into hospitals. Now, one of the things that we haven't talked about is the work done under the Blair government that I did on independent sector treatment centres, which is a fancy word for surgical hubs
Yes.
run by the private sector.
This is
built by the private
these
sector.
are these were first suggested by Eric Darzai, as probably also known as
Well, it was actually started. It had its origins, but went to scale. It had its origins in the NHS. Surgeons, a few surgeons, started to work out that actually you had to separate out the lists for emergency surgery from planned surgery.
Yes.
And that led to the idea of surgical hubs, independent, and we got the independent sector to do that. And the wicked private sector.
Just reveal yourself as the wicked Blairite. Intent on bringing the private sector into the delivery of NHS services.
Totally irresponsible person.
You're in the right place. If you look on the internet, we plead guilty to neoliberal, centrist, so-called social market.
Well, the thing about the present government, I think, is starting to reinvent something equivalent to independent sector treatment centres, surgical hubs.
Yes.
The Royal College of Surgeons has actually come out in favour of surgical hubs. Now, if you're serious about surgical hubs, you set them up as freestanding and you work them night and day. You work them really hard with day surgery and a couple of beds for the odd emergency.
Presumably you have to financially incentivise that.
You have to incentive, and you get back to patient choice. You get back to testing whether people are prepared to travel to get their care, but you start to break up the hospital because you say we don't need to do this plan, so we don't need to do hips, knees, cataract. We don't need to do them in a bog standard district general hospital. We can put them on the slip roads from a motorway. We can put them anywhere we like because people want to get rid of pain. They will travel
because first year economics, comparative
and
specialisation.
You can do what we did. You only pay these guys the NHS rate. So there's no financial incentive for them. If they can do it more efficiently, they do it more efficiently. So that is one way of breaking. But the other thing that we did, which was good now, is the Aradazi idea.
Just stop you. I'm just thinking someone really should write this down into some sort of paper and publish it at a think tank. I think if
you feel a paper coming on, James. That's good.
If I can just find someone to write it anyway, maybe we can talk about that afterwards.
Well, I think the government needs all the help it can get because
and the opposition. Our advice is available to all
I'm
parties.
still waiting to hear what the Labour Party's policy is on the NHS.
Yes.
Along with everybody else.
Where's you can tweet us too.
Because there is the other bit of it, which is the really unfinished business, is the stuff that Patricia Hewitt and I did in 2006, followed on by Aradazi. And this was to say, not only do you need surgical hubs, you actually need better facilities with more services closer to people's homes. And we're talking about more GPs being in better facilities with some diagnostic capability and actually the ability to treat people without funneling them off to an acute hospital.
Is that, I know this is what my memory saying, is that polyclinics or is that
Aradazi was polyclinic.
Yes.
My advice to him was not to call them polyclinic, call them community hospitals.
Yes.
But the idea that and that means you change the way the money flows. You start to incentive. If you look at why would you be a district nurse now when all the financial incentives are to go be a nurse in hospital?
Yeah.
So you've got a whole
So-
raft of problems about how do you incentivize.
To break, essentially your words, start breaking up its hospitals, breaking up bits of the hospitals, take some of their function, move them to specialist sites, and move other bits of them to new expanded GP practices where GPs are co-located with with lots of services, and presumably and the money will flow that way as well. The money flows away from the acute hospitals towards these.
But in some acute hospitals, you really make them brilliant,
Yes.
research-based. Take stroke in London. There used to be 32 places if you had a stroke you go to in London. We got that down to 8. So the ambulances drove past all these other hospitals to the stroke centres. That approach of putting more difficult pieces of treatment into highly focused specialist units, it's basically reinventing the London teaching hospitals, but on a smaller scale.
You're commissioned for that paper. I look forward to seeing draft in a couple of weeks. Now we've got about less than 10 minutes left. Now we haven't been touched on social care because I'm going to ask you a couple quick questions on social care and Dilnot because of your time on the Dilnot Commission, and then I've got a couple of questions from our audience. So let's try and tell the history of and solve social care in about 4 minutes. So why didn't Dilnot succeed, and what needs to happen to make you and is Dilnot still the right answer, or does a different approach now become necessary?
But Dilnot was asked to answer the question, a fairer system for individuals in how much of their wealth they gave up to pay for their social care. Basically, we invented a cap. So you would not become liable individually for more than a certain amount of money in terms of your social care. And we needn't go into the size of the cap. The cap was the cap. And that was actually dealing with a fairness issue as far as individuals. When we did our report, it was already clear that publicly funded social care was underfunded by about £1 billion a year. So this is back in 2011 when we produced our report. So hold that figure, £1 billion. The best evidence from the Institute for Fiscal Studies and the Health Foundation a couple of years ago was that you needed basically another £8 billion a year. So you needed that 1 billion had grown to 7 to 8 billion, and you needed to have a plan for reinvesting that in publicly funded social care. That has not been done, despite all the protestations that he's fixed social care. Has not been done by this Prime Minister.
But this is one where you can't reform. There's no way of reforming your way out of this. You just have to put some more public money into the system.
And what is now going to happen is it is happening. It's not Warner fantasy. It is happening. Providers of publicly funded social care are getting out of that business.
Yes.
They're handing back their contracts to local government, and they're concentrating their efforts on private. They're going up market.
Up market to the deluxe return.
And that will carry on
yes.
until you deal with it.
Yeah.
That will carry on.
Yeah.
Why would you, as an investor, want to not do that?
Right. Now we've got, according to the screen I'm looking at, 6 minutes left. A couple of questions. The first question I want to put to you from one of our viewers, Steve Black, says, has the NHS forgotten the operational and management methods that delivered the 4-hour A&E target and the 18-week elective target? Has the NHS become less good at managing and innovating than it was in your time, do you think?
I don't think anyone has pursued the issues as rigorously as we did, but we were doing. Don't forget, we were doing this. I think the management capability has got a bit slap happy, but we were doing it at the time when we could say to the NHS, look, you're going to get more money, but this is what you're going to do for the more money. Now, if you look at what's happened to the NHS since 2010-11, it was for a long time on 1%
Yeah.
real terms increase.
So
So
the current offer is,
so
the current offer is you're going to do this and get less money.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's only more recently, after Simon Stevens talked the May government into 5-year plans and more guaranteed money. So you
Yes.
would expect, and now the NHS, I think the NHS is now just overwhelmed. I don't think they've got a credible plan for doing this. And you have a sense that there's a lot of making it up as you go along.
Now another question coming from Richard Hyde. Richard was interested in Whitehall machinery, which we touched on earlier, but it's and yeah, he snappily puts it. It's essentially, was Dominic Cummings right? This is the Dominic Cummings critique of Whitehall essentially being old-fashioned and inflexible and capable of adapting to quick challenge. Is the machinery of government, to use a phrase I think popularised by one of your ministers, one of your colleagues once upon a time, John Reid, is Whitehall fit for purpose?
The answer is no, and the book says no.
Yeah.
I mean, not everyone. I mean, I think Dominic Cummings was right to a great extent about how he described the top of Whitehall. I mean, what you've got is a policy machine and not an implementation machine. Putting it very crudely, very simply. And we don't need permanent secretaries. We need chief executives and chief operating officers, and that's what we need. We need delivery.
So it's very striking. I reading not long ago a recent paper from our friends at the Institute for Government, looking at revisiting this overall question, the policy making function of government and the effectiveness of the machine. Essentially recaps on what had been. I mean, I've been hanging around. I mean, mere stripling. I've been hanging around Westminster for about 25 odd years. All the familiar questions. The churn of officials, the career structures encourage officials to leave the job after a couple of years to do a different job, and you have to get a pay rise. The Treasury has too much power and not too short term of view. The centre in number 10 has all the demand, all the authority, but none of the machine heft to get things done. I mean, why does this never change?
Well,
why has there been so little innovation? I mean, everybody. There's a widespread agreement on the critique. You're a former crossbench, former Labour minister, agreeing with that with Dominic Cummings that there's an issue with the machine. Why doesn't
you can't just reform the machine? You've got to reform some of the politics. If you have ministers who come in and don't spend more than a year, 18 months, 2 years in a job, what is their commitment to long-term change? Zero. And there is, I mean, even within political parties, changes of minister can lead to changes of policy. So you've got, what's the investment in a chief executive, former permanent secretary, being able to pursue a plan for implementation? It's not there. And I think the turnover and most of the ministers, in my experience, they may be good and intellectually sound people, but they often have no experience of actually managing change. And few governments are prepared to say, well, if I promised you 50,000 extra nurses, this is how long it's going to take me to get these 50,000 extra nurses.
Thank you. Now, the clock I can see over there tells me that we're into our last minute or so, which is why I'm picking this up and waving to the camera again, because we're going to bring things to a close. But just to repeat, this is in Pursuit of Competence. Now, where can our select Westminster audience, where can they get a hold of a copy of this if they want to read it and learn explore all that experience at more greater length?
Decent booksellers, if all else fails, Amazon, and you can get an ebook version and you can get a printed version.
Yes, in Pursuit of Competence. Life as a Westminster Nomad by Norman Warner, Lord Warner. So with that, I'm going to bring this to a close by saying thank you very much for coming. And I'm quite serious about you. We're going to do the off-camera negotiation about the paper I'd like you to write on sketching out that reform of hospitals and acute care. So this has been doubly productive in that we've had a good conversation and hopefully commissioned a paper. So with that, I will say thank you.